just to bring us up to date, we were talking about their mindset and how that now they have finished the temple, or the tabernacle, I should say. And at the end of Exodus, God's glory comes down on it. And as Zach said last time, even Moses couldn't go in at first. Remember, this isn't that long after the golden calf. These people remember coming out of Egypt. They remember the struggles they've gone through. They've seen how God provides for them. They've seen how when they step out of line, they get punished. And that's probably a little scary for them because, they went from singing and dancing after the Red Sea to building a golden calf and getting punished pretty harshly. And that pattern continues. But it was after that Moses asked them to build the temple, the tabernacle. I keep saying temple, sorry. The tabernacle. And this is one of those events that always kind of inspires me. What happened? They got so much they had to be told to stop giving. So these people were anxious to please God. They were anxious to have His favor, whether it be for fear or love or for whatever reason. They wanted to have Him on their side. They wanted to please Him. And now we get to the point where we have the tabernacle in the center of the camp, rather than the house of meeting being outside the camp. Now, in these slides, I'm always kind of disappointed. I mean, there's a couple of purposes behind this slide being up here today. Number one is telling you where I got the information from, but also these numbers here. Those were when the Israelites were numbered at the beginning of Numbers. What do those numbers include? Men 20 years older and able to fight. So it doesn't include children, women, people that are men that are not able to fight. So how many children of people were coming? Anybody remember an estimate of how many people were coming out of Egypt? About 2 million. 2 to 3, they say. It's a guesstimate, but even if you went down as low as 1 million, those numbers don't add up to 1 million. But one thing that bothers me about these slides is look at the size of the tabernacle and the size of everything else. The tabernacle was approximately 150 feet long and 75 feet wide. So it's definitely out of proportion to the camp. And if you look at these numbers, how many people will live in Melbourne in 2022? Anybody know? About 85,000. Compared to 2 million, that's a mass of people that are centered around this tabernacle. It is now the center point of their life. I'm going to go to the next slide because I like it a little better. It delineates Levi, but once again, it's so far out of scale that it's almost a little crazy. But the idea here is I wanted you to make sure to notice the Merabites, the Gershonites, and the Kohathites. I have to look to make sure. The Kohathites were in charge of moving the objects of the tabernacle. So, this didn't sit in one place. They would move from time to time. When you think of a nation of 2 million people, they couldn't stay in one place long because it would get too filthy if nothing else. Just the normal way life works. So they would have to move. When the temple moved, the Kohathites were in charge of taking the objects, the altar, the laver, the things in the holy part of the temple, the Ark of the Covenant. All of these objects were moved by the Kohathites. The curtains, the fabrics. Now, one of the things a lot of people may not realize about the tabernacle is that when it was built with pillars and stuff, and all the walls were really fabric. So the Gershonites were in charge of moving all the fabrics. And then the Merabites were Merarites, I'll get that right eventually, were in charge of moving the structure, the posts. And if you read about it, it's kind of interesting because these posts had a thing you put in the ground and then you set the post in it and had ties off and things like that. So it was a major effort. So we need to understand the temple. Now this, once again, is not a real good scale drawing, but it has one thing on it that I wanted to point out because we'll get into it today, hopefully, and that is number 6 here. We have the altar, the laver, the holies, and the Holy of Holies, and then the court. The entrance is always facing east, and one of the things that we don't think of very often, but there were specific instructions on what to do with the ashes and leftovers of the sacrifices. And they went to a ash heap, something of that nature, and it was to the east of the altar. We don't know exactly where, but it's probably somewhere in this little section here. So that's there. So we need to think about that. This is a little bit more to scale as far as the Holy and Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is 15 feet by 15 feet. The holy area is 30 feet by 15 feet. Now, if you look at these posts, that's once tells me, okay, we're out of scale again, because if that's 15 feet, it's going to be hard for that width there to be 75 feet. So try to get a little bit of scale in here, and then you have the laver and the altar again, and it shows the entrance on the east. This is a model. And once again, the size appears to be off, but the reason I wanted to put this one in here is, what are these? Anybody have any idea? They're not mentioned in the Bible. So why are they there in a model? If you go to the next slide, it may be a little clearer. They have some on this one too. Those are tables that the cattle were butchered on. Now, whether they were there or not, we have no idea of knowing. It doesn't say. But that's one of the reason I wanted to point this out is because there's so many things that they knew and that they did already. For instance, if you're hunting, I don't know how many hunters are in here today, or if you've ever hunted, and you field, let's say you shot a deer, and you field dressed the deer, did you lay it on the ground to do it, or did you put something under it? These were sacrifices that were being made to God. Were they going to lay them on the ground when they butchered them? Probably not. But it's kind of like us. How many, well, I'm not going to ask how many, but a lot of people in here have cars that you push a button to start now. You used to have to turn a key. Let's say 50 years from now, when we're no longer driving cars, maybe we have a gadget we walk through and it transports us somewhere. Who knows what it is? But we're not driving cars anymore, and somebody's reading something about a car, and it says you get in the car and you start the car. We all understand how to start a car. So we wouldn't say, well, you step on the brake and you push the button, or you turn the key and step on the gas. We wouldn't go to that detail. So it's assumed, and we need to understand it's an assumption, that some of these details are not told because they knew it already. And it was common to them, just like starting a car is to us. So whether there was tables there or not, we don't really know. And it really doesn't matter because we know that somehow cleanliness, perfection, if you want to call it that, the idea of giving something to God that was important wasn't going to be just discarded. One other point. For years and years and years when I read, it would talk about the people, and we'll get to this, talk about the people that were bringing their offerings would come to the gate or the entrance to the temple. After having studied it, most people seem to think that they actually would bring the offering over here in front of the tent of meeting here. And that's one of the problems, is because so often the entire structure is called a tent of meeting. The Holy and the Holy of Holies is called a tent of meeting, so it's a little confusing. But the general consensus is if somebody is going to bring an animal to sacrifice, they would bring it in front of the tabernacle, put their hands on the head of the animal, and then bring it to the north side of the altar to butcher it. We have enough information to know that they did butcher them on the north, or at least some of them on the north side of the altar. My tongue is getting tangled again. So, as we see this happening, I want you to think today about the impact this is having on the Israelites. Because when we come to worship, we're supposed to be involved. We're supposed to be... One of the problems with the Israelites is they had realized that you just don't come to God. You see, you just can't walk up and say, "Hey, God." That's not the attitude that they had. When they were going to go before God, when they wanted to ask God for something, we feel a need to pray for some reason, we bow our heads and pray. They would bring a sacrifice in before they approached God. So kind of keep that type of a mental attitude or a mental mindset in your eyes. Okay, let's look at some of the sacrifices for a minute. Oh, one last slide here. I'd forgotten. I wanted to show you this. This slide is obviously not a picture, a drawing, and it probably has the most reasonable scale to the tabernacle. And look how far out these tents go and how little they get in the background. Yes, sir. Right. But even the priests were careful about how they approached God, and that was my point. But yes, absolutely. But here, I put this one in for one reason, to get a little bit better scale, and even now, to me, that's not enough tents and people for the 2 million people to be gathered around the tabernacle. So having seen that, but then imagine at night, you're getting ready to go to bed and you look over and there's this pillar of fire sitting over the tabernacle. How close do you think they thought they were to God? Where was God? He was right there with them. The mornings they get up, oh, there's a pillar of smoke there. There was a reminder that God was right there. And part of where we went a couple of weeks ago was part of the reason for these Levitical laws was so that people could feel like they could be close to God. They could live with God in their midst. Because just like we know or should know, we are not perfect. They realized they did stuff they weren't supposed to sometimes too. So, okay, let's talk about the sacrifices. Leviticus chapter 5, chapter 1, through about chapter 7, talks about the different sacrifices that are being offered. Interestingly enough, we get confused on this. If you've been reading this, don't be surprised if you get confused about what they're talking about and what's going on. One commentator I read was saying that it was very obvious that this was not being, that Moses didn't have an editor. And the concept was that, if you pick up a book to read today, you expect the first few lines or paragraph to at least get your attention. See, and that's the point. They didn't need to have their attention got. They were paying attention already to this. So it's not an attention-grabbing start. This is saying, okay, this is what you need to do to be acceptable. This is how you can live with God in your midst. And it starts off, there's 5 general sacrifices: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. Those are the traditional names for these. Bear in mind, as we go through this, that very seldom was just one offering made at a time. Most of the time, there would be at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4 of them all made at one time. So it's not like we're going to come in and the Leviticus doesn't come in and say, okay, if you do this, you're going to make this offering this way this time. No, it kind of says, in fact, in the first section, it doesn't really tell us why you're doing it, why they were told to do it. They were saying, okay, we're going to have a burnt offering, and it is mentioned in there that it will work for an atonement, but it doesn't say, okay, why are you needing an atonement? Some of the others might say for specific things or specific types of sin, but the burnt offering doesn't. And it's commonly referred to think, before I get off this slide, the first section talks about, generally most people consider that to be telling the people what to do, although there is a little bit of instruction in there for the Levites. And then the last section here, 6 through 8, is talking more about, okay, Levites, here's what is going on with you in this. So as we go through these, we'll jump back and forth between those 2 sections. I've got a couple of slides on what was being done on each one of these, and you can go and do a search and find all kinds of slides and comparisons and whatnot. Be careful with them, but in general, you're going to find some fairly good information. I want to start with the burnt offering for a second here. That confused me to no end for years, because every one of those are burnt offerings. They're offerings made by fire, except for sometimes on the grain offering. And even on the grain offering, a portion was put on the altar. So what makes a burnt offering different from all the rest of them? You burn it all, except... it's not on this slide. I'll be on the next slide. I'll show you that. But it's burnt all to God. So it's generally kind of like, okay, this is a commitment sacrifice. This is saying, God, I want your attention. I'm committed to you. I want to offer you a prayer. I want to offer you thanksgiving. I've done something wrong, so here's a sin offering. This is kind of considered like I want you to be aware of me, God. Look at me. Go back to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago when God had respect to Abel's offering. He looked at it with interest. And that's kind of what you see in this is, okay, God, I'm doing this the way you said, how you said, this type of thing. I want your interest because I'm going to ask for something important, because I want forgiveness, this type of thing. So they were coming before God. Generally, it was an atonement or underscores prayers or petition and praise. This slide, it's going to be hard to read. This one, I'm going to leave up here for the rest of the time, unless I go back to one of the others. But under portions, it's under portions up here, you may not be able to see it. It has God, the priests, and the people. And when it's talking about the burnt offering, it says God gets it all except the skin. And we'll look at that very specifically in just a minute. But in this case, none and none. And I'm going to go back to this one because this one has a little bit bigger. You can see the priestly portions and the lay people portions. Okay, so let's go. A couple of things real quick. So they understood that sin was a serious matter. Again, sin and uncleanness were not the same thing. But they both had to be purified or cleansed before they could deal with God. That was part of what was going on here. God was right there in their midst. And I want to stop here just long enough to say, He's right here in our midst too. This is one of the things we can learn about from this. God's here with us. If we're a Christian, He's put His Spirit in us. So I think sometimes we have lost the importance of God being in our midst. And seeing them, learning about it, helps me. And the last thing I want to mention before we actually get to the scripture is, even in the Old Testament, God said to do this. But it wasn't just doing it that made the difference. They had to come before God correctly. And by that, generally, it means humbly, contritely. If you look over in Amos chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, there's a quote from God, Amos speaking. It says, I despise your feast days, and I will not smell in your solemn assemblies. Though you offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beast. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of the viols, but let judgment run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. So the concept is, this has got to affect your lives. You can't just come up here and offer these. I won't accept it. This has to affect the way you live and the way you live, not just when you're in the tabernacle. One thing I wanted to mention before we go on, the grain sacrifice. If you're reading ahead, then you've gotten to the second chapter, and if you're reading in the King James, it talks about the meat offering. And that's another one that confused me for years. But in the time that the King James was really translated, meat meant meal. It was kind of like if you had a meat, you had a whole meal. And so in some cases, it has been translated now, instead of meat, meal. Two other more recent names for it being grain and cereal. I don't like cereal because when I think of cereal, I think of what we get in a box for breakfast. But in the context of where it's a grain, it's corn, it's wheat, it's something like this. That's the type of thing. And it also is connected to the first fruits, which we'll get to when we get into that section. But when you see that, and you're reading, and it says, if you offer me a meat offering, it's not talking about beef. It's talking about grain. So don't let that confuse you too much. It did me, so. Okay, so. Leviticus 1, verses 1 through 17. I'm going to read this out of the ESV simply to avoid some of the wording issues that are so not what we use today. Starting in verse 1. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering from the livestock of the herd and from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat on the wood that is on the fire on the altar. But its entrails and legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. I'm going to stop here because I didn't mention this before. In the ESV, it says a food offering. If you look in other versions, it might say an offering by fire. So I'm not sure how those two come together, but that's what's going on there. That's an interesting translation. I'm not sure about that. Verse 10. If the gift for a burnt offering is from the flock, from the sheep or the goats, he shall bring a male without blemish, and he shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall throw the blood against the sides of the altar, and he shall cut it into pieces with its head and its fat, and the priest shall arrange them on the wood that is on the fire on the altar, but the entrails and the legs he shall wash with water. And the priest shall offer it all, and the priest shall offer all of it, burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. If his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or pigeons. And the priest shall bring it to the altar and wring off his head and burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained out on the side of the altar. He shall remove its crop and its contents and cast it beside the altar on the east side in the place for the ashes. He shall tear it open by its wings, but shall not sever it completely. And the priest shall burn it on the altar on the wood that is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And I want us to jump over to Leviticus 6, starting in verse 8, and read the priest side of it for just a second. Excuse me. Leviticus 6, verse 8. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Command Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth, on the altar, all night until the morning. And the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. And the priest shall put on his linen garment and put on his linen undergarment on his body, and he shall take up the ashes to which the fire was reduced, the burnt offering on the altar, and put them on beside the altar. Then he shall take off his garments and put on other garments and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it, and it shall not go out. The priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and he shall arrange the burnt offering on it and shall burn it. The fat of the peace offering, the fire shall be kept burning on the altar continually. It shall not go out. So there's a couple of things that, as we read this, that immediately I want to mention. The first one is the order of what's going on here. First, he says, okay, the section in the first chapter is divided up into three sections. From the herd, from the flock, and fowls. And we're not told, but it's generally believed that there are three offerings here, and that they are so that everybody can afford to make an offering. Not everybody, okay, remember, these folks raised flocks, cattle. They were nomads. That was what they did. Grain would be more precious to them than the cattle because they wouldn't stay in one place long enough to grow crops a lot of times. So that type of a concept we need to get in our minds. But if you could afford it, you gave a bull. If you couldn't afford it, you gave from the flock. If you couldn't afford that, everybody could catch a turtle dove or a pigeon. That was the concept there. There was no reason for you not to offer, but at the same time, what should you offer the Lord? The best. And that's kind of part of what's being said here on some of this. But if you remember when David was offering, and he said when he was he offered to buy a vineyard to offer to the Lord, to make sacrifice to the Lord. And I've forgotten the name of the guy, but he said, I'll give it to you. I'll give you everything you need to sacrifice to the Lord. And David said, no, I am not going to offer my God something that cost me nothing. So they understood the concept that I need to sacrifice, and that I need to sacrifice something that means something. Now think about this for a minute. These people were offering the lives of these animals. They understood that the life of this animal was being given in place of their life. That's an important concept. Okay, so what are some of the other things you noticed in this reading? Who lit the fire? God did. Over in, hold on a second, I've got it here. Have to find it. It was a point I was making later, but I've got it here somewhere. I thought I had it here. I wrote it down, I just don't have it, didn't write it down where I would find it. It was in Leviticus 9, I believe. Here it is, Leviticus 9 and 24. Can somebody read that? Leviticus 9 and 24. Okay, this is kind of like, think about this for a minute. The fire came from God and lit the altar and consumed the sacrifice that had been put on the altar. A couple things. Does that remind you of any other thing? Any other event? Elijah? Okay. It also should remind us of Nahab and Abihu. Because Nahab and Abihu offered strange fire on the incense. What constituted strange fire? The fire they were supposed to light the incense with was from the altar that was never allowed to go out. So it was fire that God had started. So that might bring a couple of things together for you there. What else did you notice? Why a male bull? Why a male cow from the herd? If you're like me, my first thing goes to, well, Christ was a male type thing. But think for a minute about cost. And it may have something to do that Christ was a male. I don't know. We're not told for sure why that was the case. But think about cost for a minute. These are herdsmen. Which is more valuable, a male or a female? Female. Female is actually more valuable in one sense. Females produce milk. They produce babies, more cows. So it's a continual value. So it's quite, if you've ever worked on a farm, you know you may have a lot of cows, but you only have one or two bulls. A lot of places only have one because they don't like to live together. But still, one or two bulls because that's all you need to keep the herd going. But from that standpoint, from a rarity standpoint, it's more valuable. So not sure, but it's interesting that it is specified as a male because other sacrifices are specified as females. Why? We don't know, and that's the reason I'm bringing this out. To my knowledge, we have no indication of why, in most cases, that is the case. But it is important to understand that they were told to do it this way. So that's what they were doing. What about the without blemish part? The best, was it a messianic prophecy? Was it a shadow? But the idea was you don't give something to God that's not perfect. You don't give something to God because, oh, this one is lame. I can't use him. He's going to die anyway. No, you gave an animal that was out without blemish or your best. So you're starting to see this is not just the law. This was what they understood and knew how to do. It's being codified for them. What's this laying of the hand on the head of the beast in front of the tabernacle? Any idea what's going on there? If nothing else, it is an acknowledgement that this beast is in my spot. I don't know that it actually transfers sins or anything like that. Yeah, it's like, yeah. So it's kind of like, okay, this makes it personal to the guy that's doing it, to the person that's doing it. This makes it a little bit closer here because he's saying, yeah, I need to do this. And if it is indeed right in front of the tabernacle, there's that flame or that smoke, that cloud of smoke. God's right there. You're starting to see how embedded in their life God is. And that's another lesson we need to learn, I think. Did you notice who was to kill the animal? This is one of those things that there's a little debate on. The way it reads in English, it seems like it's supposed to be the person that is bringing the offering in is to kill the beast. Now, I want you to picture something here. Let's say you're really good and you actually can lead a bull calmly in front of a tent with altar over here, blood everywhere, and that bull is not going to freak out, number one. I've always just been amazed that they could even do this. I don't know how they did it. I don't know if God made it easy for them to do. I don't know. But if you ever watch anybody actually working with cattle, you realize they don't cooperate that easily. And then they kill it. And somehow, once again, this is one of those things we're not told exactly how it happens. Somehow, they collect the blood. So it is supposed that the throat is cut and that it is drained into a bucket or pan or something. Once again, we don't know. This is one of those things they knew how to do. They didn't have to have a specific instruction. But we know it was collected somehow because it was splashed on the altar. What's the difference between a splash or a throw and a sprinkle? Think of a sprinkle as a splash or throw it. This is not just a sprinkle. They were throwing blood on the altar. Do you see how this could be messy? Do you see why God might have ordered them to have some of these strong-smelling scents around to clean everything? It's an interesting picture to get in your head, but it also should have us saying, okay, how does this relate to me? I'm not supposed to go through these offerings. But it's showing us how critical life is for life. How critical Christ's sacrifice is for us. Sometimes I think we get this concept in our head, well, Christ died for us. Then you look at all these cattle, all these sheep, goats, all these birds that were sacrificed. And this was going on continually. This was not something that happened once a day. It was time after time after time, day after day after day after day. The fire was never allowed to go out. It was always taking a pleasing aroma up to God. A couple of things real quick before we get there. We noticed that he, assumingly the offerer, would flay or skin the beast. And if we look in, I think it's Leviticus 7:8, the notification I have written down. It says actually that the priest that offers the burnt offering would get the skin. It was all burnt, but for some reason he was flaying it, and therefore it appears that that is connecting to that. There's a little debate on that. But still, that seems to be the way it is. We're not sure who, once again, most likely the offerer, but many people think it was the priest that would cut the beast up. Now, why would you cut a bull up to put it on an altar? Can you imagine trying to pick a bull up? So they butchered it. And some people say, well, the priest would be doing it so often, they would know how to do it good and this type of thing, so they would be able to do it. We do know that the priest took the pieces and arranged them on the altar, and the wording indicates that the arrangement was like, okay, we're going to put it back like it was. So it's cut in pieces and then moved to the altar. Why did the person not put it on the altar? Why did the priest put it on the altar? Number one, they were told to. Number two, the altar was holy. And anything that touched the altar was holy, dedicated to God. The priests were cleansed and considered holy. To put something unholy would be desecration. So the lay people would generally not do that. That, once again, we're not given a lot of specifics. We're just told that the priest did it. So we're making some assumptions there. They were told to wash the entrails and the legs. Any concepts on why? We're not told, but there's some pretty clear indications. What? The entrails would have, for lack of a better term, fecal matter in them. The legs, possibly from natural events in life, have the same thing. So the idea was to clean it, yes, because those were the dirtiest areas. Oh, I didn't get near as far as I wanted to today. Things to think about for next week. Notice as you read, a food offering or an offering by fire happens almost on every one of them you read about. An aroma to the Lord. Start thinking about how that fits in and why the difference is in the way the fowl was handled. Thank you for your attention.